Okay then, folks. Good evening, and you're all welcome to join us this evening for the Coventry Green New Deal hustings for the West Midlands Metro Mayor election, which will take place on the 6th of May. This, we believe, is the second hustings in what will be a series of hustings for these people who are going to be incredibly busy over the next couple of months. And the first thing we have to just inform you of, and this is entirely an error on our part, but we've had a little bit of a timing issue with Andy Street, the Conservative candidate, and as a result of that, he will not be able to join us until about 7:30. So what we're going to do, and this has been agreed by all, that we're going to essentially carry on, and we're going to go through the next half an hour with the questions, and then when Andy is able to join us, we're going to allow Andy to answer the questions that the other candidates have answered, so as we can get all of the candidates' views on the questions that have been posed. I think David has explained to you the rules of engagement, and that is that because of the fact that we're doing it virtually, we're going to run it very differently to how we would do as a physical hustings, in that we're going to not have yourselves actually be able to interact very much, but you can use the chat channel and you can use the Q&A channel, and those messages will come through, so you can do that. But unfortunately, we haven't got the ability to make it an interactive event because the technology just is not really up to it, really. Or being more honest, I don't think we're up to the technology being able to manage that sort of thing very well. Now, what's been brilliant, though, is that I think, according to David Chapman from the University of Warwick, we've had well over 100 people who have booked into this event, and we've had about 40 questions in. So what we've done is we've grouped the questions into topics, and we're going to ask a melded question on behalf of a number of people that has been come in, and then we'll go through the situation like that. But it will basically be a little bit boring for you, in that it will be me, and my name is Chris Crean. I'm the regional campaigner for Friends of the Earth in the West Midlands. But it will be me sort of like saying what's going on and asking all the questions. So unfortunately, we won't get any of you being able to do that. But what we're going to do is we're going to allow each, yes, you will see the candidates. Don't worry about that. What we'll do is we'll bring the candidates in when they're speaking. And then you'll be able to get rid of me, which I think you'll all be quite pleased about. The other thing is that the candidates will have 2 minutes to answer each question. Now, we've got a load of clocks around here, and we'll be very, very strict. This is exactly what the West Midlands Voice did on Friday at their hustings. And we're basically going to say two minutes per question. And then, like, obviously they can finish a sentence, but we're going to really try and hone it down so as we can get through as many questions as possible. And also we will actually be able to see your comments in the chat box, and also if you do put some questions, we might be able to relate them to some of the questions that we're going to be asking. We've also, now this is a bit more technology with it. Whether it'll work or not, I don't know. But we're going to give you the opportunity to think about what you might do in terms of voting. So we'll give that about 10 minutes, and then we might well come back later on and do it again later on in the evening. Anyway, we'll see what happens with that. Now, essentially, in terms of the timing, you've got to think of me as Jackie Weaver, and I have got the mute button, or the people behind the scenes have got the mute button. So if people are going off tandem, or if they're going on for far too long, then we will actually be quite brutal in actually bringing their contributions to a close, because we will give as much fairness to everybody as possible, so as they can actually have a go at every question, and we don't actually see people dominating the discourse. So I hope that will be okay with all the candidates and okay with yourselves. And we're also going to hopefully give people a minute to sum up at the end. Very, very quickly, Coventry Green New Deal is a network of organisations which are trying to solve the climate emergency in Coventry, supported by specialist organisations, trade unions, community groups and local politicians. And they're bringing together experts, communities and politicians to find ways to support individuals, communities and citywide developments to make changes necessary to reduce carbon emissions and ensure a cleaner, greener Coventry. And our other sponsor, which is Coventry and Warwick Green Week, has been going, I believe, for about 20 years, but it was originally set up by People and Planet in the Students' Union, along with the sustainability team at Warwick University. It's now in its 4th year of a new collaboration between the University of Warwick, Coventry University and Coventry City Council and Warwick District Council, along with a number of local individuals, groups and organisations, to actually promote discourse and events through a week in early March about how we can deal with some of our environmental issues. So I think that's it from me. And as you can see from my backdrop, I'm here in Coventry this evening, and I'm just going to quickly allow all of the candidates to very, very quickly introduce themselves, and they can say who they are, who they're representing, and either what they had for breakfast or where they're broadcasting from. And we'll go in the order of Jenny first, and we're going to try now get Jenny into the, how's that? Yes, so Jenny.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm Jenny Wilkinson, a candidate for the Liberal Democrats, and I'm trying to think what I had for breakfast. I think it was a peanut butter and jam smoothie, which is a Joe Wicks recipe special.
Brilliant, thank you. And now, Steve.
Thanks, Chris. Steve Caudwell. I'm the Green Party candidate, and I'm a councillor in Solihull. And this morning for breakfast, I had exactly the same thing I always do, which is a grapefruit and lots of coffee.
So a healthy and a unhealthy one at the same time. Next, we're going to go to Liam.
Hi everyone, my name's Liam Byrne. I'm the Labour's candidate. I'm a member of Parliament here in the faraway land of Birmingham. My breakfast, a little bit like Steve, coffee, but porridge is what I do daily.
Great stuff. And finally, for this evening, at the moment, Mr. Weller.
I'm Tim Weller, and I'm an independent candidate because I'm so very concerned about the climate emergency and the fact that our conventional politicians seem to be doing nothing to respond.
What did you have for breakfast?
A bowl of cereal. And I live in Hales Zoe, where I'm sitting now.
There we go.
Okay, so Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands currently, Conservative Party candidate, muesli for breakfast.
So my name's Ashvir Sangha. I'm an independent candidate for Mayor of the West Midlands. I'm the grandson of Sikh farmers from the Punjab in India who came to the UK in the 1950s in search of opportunity. My background's in education, and I think I represent a new vision, a new generation getting involved in politics. And I had oats for breakfast.
Okay, oats for breakfast, lovely. Okay, thank you very much. Right then, we're going to go into the first question, and this is the climate, sort of the overarching climate question. And what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question. This come from David Humphreys, Gary Askew, Andrew Bradley, and a number of other people. And essentially what we want you to tell us is, what will be your climate change priority during the period of office, which is the next 4 years? And what do you think is the most effective way you could reduce the carbon footprint of the West Midlands? And for that, we're first of all going to go to Jenny.
Thank you, Chris. It's really difficult when we look at this because it feels like there's an overwhelming amount of things to do. I think firstly to acknowledge in terms of the impact of our greenhouse gas emissions, transport's obviously the biggest factor here. Energy supply and heating are also very significant. So I would look at reducing car use, moving to green public transport and active travel, local renewable energy generation. And in terms of buildings, passive house standards for new builds, and also retrofitting insulation and heating systems for existing properties. But I think I'd like to really look at the whole thing a bit more holistically. The climate emergency can only be tackled effectively by ensuring that all decisions that councils, businesses, communities, households make all move us in the direction of net zero objective. So what I want to do is have a climate impact lens on all decisions that are made, with the environment being taken into consideration by the combined authority, by our councils, in all decisions that they're making. We need to be thinking about what is the impact, what do we need to do in terms of climate and also the ecological emergency. So every decision we're making is looking through those lenses. At the moment, loads of councils are declaring climate emergencies, but they're not really doing anything to address that. So they're still, you know, building new roads, looking at airport expansions. We really need to take a step back from everything that we're doing and all work together, councils, business, public services, educational authorities, individuals, and really have that carbon pathway to deliver the cuts that we need across all sectors and all areas. So it's really that sort of carbon neutral aim of every decision and everything that we're doing.
Okay, and that was brilliant timing, Jenny. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go on to Steve.
Thanks, Chris. So I would make 2030 the West Midlands Combined Authority's target date for net carbon neutrality. 2050 and 2041 are out of date, and they have been since the IPCC report of October 2018. There's another report due out this year, and it's going to be really intriguing to see how COP26 engages with the new scientific realities that brings. But I know actually that to support this target and play their part, they need to be safe, they need secure housing, they need to be able to actually get around to take advantage of the opportunities that aiming for 2030 can bring. And that's why my 3 key pledges are to end our poverty scandal, to bring about a genuinely green industrial revolution, and to deliver a transport system you can actually use, because it's by fixing today's problems that we'll be best equipped to take on the challenges in front of us. Now, in the short term, I, as Mayor, would review all of the capital expenditure projects that the combined authority either partially or fully funds. I would be looking at the terms of reference of all the boards, all the enterprise partnerships, all the quangos that the combined authority sits on or supports, to make sure that they align with that target. And one of the first things I would do is I would appoint a female deputy mayor with a specific remit for addressing the strategy to meet 2030, because this is a change in vision. It's not tinkering at the edges. If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. And we've had 100 years of Team Red and Team Blue at the helm, and we're now 9 years away from irreversible climate damage. So we've got to start doing things differently if we're going to deliver a West Midlands that works for everyone. And as your mayor, that would be my commitment.
Thanks very much, Steve. Now over to Ashvir.
But I think that the overall focus of any mayor should be on quality of life. And I think we should aim to be one of the quality of life capitals of the world. And a crucial part of that is how healthy an environment we all live in. And I think that there are a few too many gimmicks. And I think an example of an environmental gimmick, in my opinion, is actually the congestion charge, or clean water charge. There's all sorts of names for it. That's probably going to do more actually address the issue of clean air, in my opinion. And I think a very simple priority that pretty much anyone can unite around is greening the city region, planting trees in our public spaces, greening our offices, greening our housing developments. I think that's a great rallying place to start.
Go on then, Liam.
Chris, thanks. So we've got about 7 big things that we need to do. I mean, the overriding goal for me as mayor is to ensure that our region is the first net zero carbon cities region in the country. Now, in a few days' time, the current mayor will take a report through that proposes a net zero target of sometime in the 2040s. That's much too slow. It basically proposes to reduce the 11 megatons that we release each year down by about 13% each year. I want to push that target up to at least 16% cuts each year. That would allow us to go net zero carbon sometime in the mid 2030s. So that's the first point. Second point, we then have to get the whole region behind us, which is why ahead of COP a bit later on in the year in Glasgow, we need our own West Midlands COP that basically brings people together from across the West Midlands to rally behind that target and explain to each other how we are going to pull together to hit that ambitious target. Now, there's a few components to that plan that we're going to need to get right. So on homes, we're going to have to decarbonise heat. Retrofitting is probably our biggest challenge as a region. We're going to need devolved control of the Green Homes Grant. It's been a catastrophe run from the centre in Westminster. We need it here so that we can crack on with the job. Second, we're going to need to help industry decarbonise, which is why we're going to propose a network of green development zones across the region where you've got ready access to zero waste facilities, renewable energy, as well as green skills. Third, as Jenny said, and Steve majored on, we've got to decarbonise our transport system. The decarbonisation of the transport system, that has got to be the central mandate for transport for the West Midlands. That means a radical expansion of things like very light rail, made in Coventry, and a radical expansion of our electric vehicle charging network. At the moment, it's about the worst in the region.
And
you have to do a zero-based review of the money to make sure that all of the investment is pointing to that target. So these are things that we can do if good people come together to choose to lead.
Okay, you drabbed a bit of time there, Liam. So next time I might be a bit, but hey ho, you're smiling about it. That's okay.
Right, recognised we are in a COVID, climate, ecological, nature emergency. Everything is interlinked to make for a healthier planet, and I have signed the commitment. The more we spend, the more finite fossil fuels get used up, and our wealthy Western societies are centred, indeed locked and trapped into this equation. Burn fossil fuels equals greenhouse gases to enhance dangerously the naturally protective greenhouse layer, equals worsening climates around the world to threaten all life on Earth, equals ultimately the end. David Attenborough, over 2 years ago at COP24 in Poland, spoke of collapsing civilizations, the extinction of much of the natural world, and time is running out unless we act. Therefore, spend only on the essential 101 projects that will definitely cut greenhouse gases the quickest. And that means scrapping more metro tram extensions that are the second most expensive transport mode to construct after HS2. Metro is unnecessary because the bus on rails trams replace buses directly on roads. And the trams simply bring an additional change between now 3 kinds of transport, and possibly even ultra-light rail, very light rail, and light rail. It's crazy. Therefore, a worse public transport journey and more congestion on the roads results. So stop the constant building, demolition, rebuilding cycle that is so ruinous for our prospects. Bill Gates in his book says that making steel and cement are responsible for about 10% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And a personal declaration of a climate action is this: lag yourself and your home and never have the room you live in any higher than 20 Celsius. I'm sitting here in 5 layers and the temperature is, well, it's certainly below 20.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim. Well timed.
Okay, so I think the question really is, what's the single thing that we should do quickest? And I'll give you a very honest answer to this, because this is the answer is a domestic retrofit. And the reason I call that out is 2 things. Number one, if you look at the stats, a third of emissions are from domestic heat. And so it's hugely significant, but it's also the area that we have least progress visible at the moment. So transport and industry are broadly equal as well, and we've got a lot of progress there, but this is the area that's proving most elusive. The other reason I'm attracted to it is, of course, the very act will create a lot of jobs. And the second reason is it's got a real inclusive element to it in terms of the people who suffer most from this, are those who can least afford their heating. So that would be my priority for further action beyond what we can already see.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And we're going to move on now, and we're going to move on to a question that's come in. Well, a couple of people specifically asked this question. Carol Hyatt from Wolverhampton, Penn, and Ed Porteous from Sandwell in the Black Country. And they're part of an organisation called Divest West Midlands. And their question is, do the candidates agree that the over £500 million invested by the West Midlands Pension Fund into fossil fuel companies undermines the combined authorities' declared climate emergency? If this £500 million was divested, how would the candidates rather see this money reinvested? And in terms of who's going to have a go at that first, we're going to go to Liam.
Thanks, Chris. So the fund should divest. Let's just remember whose money it is. So the money belongs to the pension savers who have paid into this fund over many years. So this is not free money. This is somebody's pension that we're talking about. But it does, in my view, need divesting from fossil fuels. And there's three things that we need to do with it. So one, we need to make sure that the money is being invested in Paris compliant investments. So if you look at the studies now that have been produced by a whole range of advisors, you can now see that the returns on the Paris compliant investments are actually just as good, if not better, than ordinary market returns. So you can actually protect people's pensions for the long term and do the right thing for the environment by making that switch. Second, there's a strong case for the fund helping capitalise a West Midlands People Savings Bank. So a number of regions around the country are setting up cooperative banks. Probably Bristol in the southwest is most advanced. I would like to set up a banking commission that explored how we could do that, but certainly with about 10 million of tier one capital, you can set up a bank that is capable and robust enough to lend about £500 million to businesses in the region who will need a bit of extra finance support in order to make the leap to net zero carbon. And the sooner that we do that, the faster we will make the leap. Third thing we need to do, we should be making sure that we are investing in community development finance, so that for those businesses with a double bottom line, in other words, creating jobs as well as turning a profit, there are good sources of local finance available. It's something that is very common across America, that obviously enjoys things like the Community Banking Act. It's something that we should be pioneering here in the West Midlands too.
Thanks very much, Liam. Ash.
I think it's a great question. I think it's an example of an area where mayoral convening power can come into play, where it's a classic example of a situation where the mayor can knock heads together, get people in the room for a conversation. But to be honest, those pension fund holders need to be reassured that if you pull £500 million worth of investment from one set of investments and one set of assets, that it's got somewhere wise to go. So I think that side of things needs to be addressed, and for it to be shifted, there has to be great places for it to go. And I would get those people around the table as well, people who work on investments, climate investments, get them around the table, people who work in climate venture capital, find proper places where that money could be invested wisely, because that's the only way, frankly, that mayoral convening power, Chris, will have any impact. So I don't want to promise something that the mayor can't do, but I want to give an indication of the kind of direction of travel we could take.
Okay, thank you, Ashvir. Now move on to Steve.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I would at least partially agree with both Liam and Ashvir and their answers. I mean, I would be amazed if any of the candidates would disagree with the concept of divesting from the from fossil fuels, given the nature of the hustings we're at this evening. It is an absolute no-brainer. And my group in Solihull has been pressuring this for several years now. But I think Ashvir is absolutely right in two regards. One, we have to remember that these are people's pensions, and whilst it's a lot of money and we could do a lot of good with it, at the same time we do have to be cognizant of the fact that this is money and returns that people are relying on to see them through their golden years. So we do have to be prudent. One thing that I think is really important to note is, so I have investments and I have a financial advisor, and when I made my investments, I told that financial advisor, I don't want any fossil fuels as part of my portfolio, and I want as many ethical investments as I can. But that's a conversation that I have with my financial advisor. He doesn't just go away and do it for me. So I think having a participatory investment planning strategy for that money is absolutely the right thing to do. So those people who are reliant on the return should have a say on where it goes. Having said that, if it was up to me, one of the things that I would really love to use that money on is social and genuinely affordable housing throughout the combined authority, because we're in the middle of a housing crisis, and £500 million would be a fantastic injection of funds to do something serious about that. We've got a, well, I think we're going to come on to a little bit later, development strategies and what the best way to do that is. But local authorities have got to start taking more of a lead in how we address the housing crisis, because what we're doing at the moment is not working. So personally, I'd like to see some of the money go in that direction if it happens.
Thank you very much. And we now move on to Tim.
Well, I'm one of Steve's people in my golden years, so I rely on the West Midlands Pension Fund. But I have signed the petition that we should divest from it, but we still haven't reached 1,000 signatures yet, and I would urge you, please, all of you, to sign it if you possibly can. I also invest ethically, and I'm a strong supporter of a family of cooperative organizations called Energy for All, and they invest in renewables, particularly hydro, wind, and solar. And it's essential that we invest in solar panels and in wind turbines in order to get out of fossil fuels as fast as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. And we're now going to move on to Jenny.
I think I'm going to gone before me pretty much. So, I mean, yes, absolutely, divestment should go ahead. I do think it's outrageous at the moment when we've got, you know, a climate emergency, that we've got 500 million sitting in fossil fuels, and that's, you know, only going to drive the problem further. So I think that's really important. In terms of what we do with the money, again, I sort of will echo what everyone else has said, really. Yes, I think Tim's point on renewable energy, I'm keen to actually see local energy schemes and facilitate local energy schemes. So I think that's one of the areas these funds could be used in. And then I'm going to with Steve around social housing. We do desperately need affordable homes across the region. So actually having the opportunity for councils to be directly investing in social housing, I think would be a real benefit and would really drive the affordable housing needs forward, because, you know, there's a desperate need and a real shortage of supply. And I think the way to tackle that is for more direct public sector investment in housing. So I think that would be a good use of the funds. And then the other aspect would be to support our local businesses and to support local businesses that are driving forward on green technologies, green credentials and providing that sort of boost to the green businesses across the region. So those are sort of 3 areas that I'd be really keen to see the money going towards. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jenny.
Yeah, of course. So it'd be so tempting to come on here and agree with that, but I've decided to sort of word to self for the whole of these things is I've got to be completely honest with people. And the answer is no, I would not instruct that of the pension fund. Now, let's be clear. I would hope that as much cash as possible from our fund could be put into renewable sources, businesses creating great new sources of profit for themselves in a really good way. But I do not believe that we could strain the activity of the pension fund, because their mission is to produce a return for our pensioners. And it is very important that those pensioners get a good return for the future. And I would not instruct them to change the investment strategy. I do, of course, believe that companies that have made their history in fossil fuels are being forced to change, but partly by regulation, partly by public opinion, and hopefully they will become far more responsible businesses. But I would not instruct that change.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Very concise. And because it's the West Midlands, we couldn't have an event like this without talking about transport. And we've had this from a combination of Susan Ramuse, Colin Brown and Adam Tranter. And essentially it says, decarbonisation of transport is a key goal of transport strategy. What are your views on this? And specifically, do you see motorcycles or e-bikes maybe as a benefit in delivering this ambition? And do you support the government's target come from the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister of 50% of all journeys in urban areas should be walked or cycled by 2030? And I'm going to go for that one straight to Steve, please.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so the Green Party says that active travel should be the primary mode. The best measure I've seen of this is that all journeys under 5 kilometres should be walked or cycled if possible. Now, obviously, that depends massively on the infrastructure and the conditions. Our roads are notoriously hostile to cyclists and pedestrians, and that needs to change. I think Jenny mentioned earlier that transport emissions are one of the big 3 contributors to climate change, along with property and food production, and it's one that we can bring under control quickly if we choose to, if the political will is there, if we're not going to keep running from the likes of the Institute for Economic Affairs or the Taxpayers Alliance or the Fair Fuel Lobby. We've got less than 9 years to bring about a step change in the way that we do transport. So it has to move much faster than either Team Red or Team Blue seem to be comfortable with. To address the point about motorcycles, obviously they contribute less to congestion than other vehicles, including electric vehicles, and they take up less road space when they're parked. But the question still has to be one about emissions profiles. And I think, yeah, Chris, what you're saying about e-bikes in particular could be the way forward with those. Finally, I don't think 50% goes far enough. I think it should be as many as possible by 2030. Why not 60% or 80% or even more? Like I said, it's a question of political will, and I'm not sure the other parties have got that.
Thank you very much. Over to Jenny.
One of the fundamental problems we've got here is that our transport systems across the region at the moment are inadequate, and cars are therefore seen as a necessity for so many journeys. We've got to have a real sort of green revolution in terms of transport and be really radical and have a step change in infrastructure spend across the West Midlands. If we're using cars to the extent where they're needed, then yes, they have to be electric vehicles, and we can improve the accessibility of charging points and make those readily available, including in leisure centres, shopping centres, and also on-street points for residential areas. But the problem with electric cars is, of course, they don't eliminate the dangers from the particulates from tyres and brakes and so on, which also causes pollution. And they're not going to address the problem of congestion. In fact, the chances are congestion is going to be worse because everyone will feel they're fine driving around. So we've really got to have a transport strategy that moves people away from cars for the vast majority of our journeys. And that's got to be a combination of good public transport that's reliable, that's affordable, and in itself is low emissions. So, we need to be looking at electric and hydrogen options. On motorcycles, clearly the actual, the size of the vehicles means that, they're less costly to produce. But, we've got to be looking at electric motorcycles if we're looking at that. And those are then a sort of practical option for those journeys where it's too far to walk or cycle on conventional bikes. But really the priority has to be on active travel, and I completely support, at least 50%. I think that's the minimum, really. And we've got to really invest in the infrastructure for that. So it's not just about shoving a cycle lane on the side of a road, in a token sort of attempt to pretend that we've then put in cycle lanes. It's got to be, properly thought out and properly planned, dedicated space for cycling and for pedestrians that's away from vehicles, has proper prioritizations at junctions. We have storage for cycles, parking for cycles. And what I really want to see is to really reduce the need for cars by looking at where we put our new developments in and looking at the 15-minute neighbourhood model where everybody can walk or cycle to the vast majority of the facilities they need on a day-to-day basis. So we've really got to completely rethink how we structure our urban areas.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Over to Ashvir.
Well, I think it may be an odd place to start, Chris, but I promise it will make sense. I think we need to really focus on reopening the region. I think we need to accelerate the vaccine rollout. I think we need to accelerate the unlocking. And I think that the devastation, both economically and to health and well-being, is really starting to mount, in my opinion. So I think an incoming mayor on the 6th of May should really step on it in terms of that path to reopening, I would say by the end of May. I think if we don't do that, to link it back in, we'll have a hard time motivating people to care about any of these other areas, any of these other issues, because that's so dominant in people's lives right now. And I think there's great local organizations that we can connect with to help understand the right way to go about decarbonizing transport and making other forms of moving around local areas better. The 15-minute neighborhoods example, I think, was already mentioned by Jenny, I think, or Steve. But I think it's that the 50-minute neighborhood model is an interesting one. It's got to be practical for people to be able to take alternative forms of transport. We should talk to Sustrans, the Sustainable Transport Organization, and others to figure out how to actually get it done. And the final point I'd make is that post-COVID, with more remote working, I think that could also see an easing of pressure on transport and fewer people needing to commute to work, which is probably a good thing, not just for transport, but possibly also for their mental well-being, not being stuck in traffic for an hour plus every day.
Thanks very much, Ashvir. And over to Liam. You're on mute, Liam. It's the old
bound to happen.
In reverse.
So I think, we have got to bring a sense of urgency to this. So every hour we release greenhouse gas pollution the size of 9 double-decker buses. So we'll have, by the time we finish tonight, that's about 20 more double-decker buses worth of greenhouse gas pollution into the atmosphere, not counting the hot air that's emerged from tonight. So I think there are 5 or 6 things we need to do, because look, we've got I think it's about 1.4 million cars in the West Midlands. About 67% of journeys at the moment are by car, and that is in large part because our public transport system is really not very good. Now that's partly because we're not building new public transport quick enough. So I tease Andy that in his annual report we declared the big signature transport achievement last year was a 1.5 mile tram track. There are literally snails that go 5 times further in the course of a year. I know he'll come back at me quite rightly about that. But look, there is also a really significant black hole in the transport budget for the region. And we've got to look at whether we can actually deploy very light rail made in Coventry at a much more rapid pace to fill the gap. Second thing we've got to do, we've got to make sure our bus fleets are all electric. Well done, Coventry, for leading the way. Well done, National Express, for stepping it up. Needs to go a hell of a lot faster. Our EV charging network is terrible. And then you come to active travel. We have the highest unmet cycle need in the country. Our cycle track plans are about 14 times smaller than Greater Manchester. Leicester is building about a mile of cycleway a week. And so we've got to sign up to targets, sort of with the Greens on, in that I think we should be going, if any, a little bit further. But one of the things I want to do when it gets to things like bikes, e-bikes, is make the talk to the cycle mayor in Birmingham, great guy. You know, he'll tell you that if you put in an order for an e-bike tomorrow, it'll be November before it arrives because of all the shortages that we've now got. So we need to be thinking strategically about how we make the public transport here as well.
Thank you very much, Liam. And over to Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much. So let's be clear, overall, I'm committed to the WM 2041 campaign for carbon neutrality by 2041 with a detailed plan to deliver it. A third of the progress has to be made in transport, and the progress we are already making there is, if you look at the capital being invested in public transport in the region, it is 5 times what it is in the year before mayoral elections. So huge commitment there. The particular piece around active travel, utterly committed to that, indeed the government's target as well. And again, there we have a clear plan of what we're trying to do. We're colouring in, as I call it, the Starley network of 500 miles across the region. And just today, we've had the announcement with Coventry of the next stage of the Binley Road segregated scheme. Of course, on cycling, we've just launched the region-wide cycle hire scheme as well. And those bikes are indeed made in Stratford-on-Avon and all the kit elsewhere in the West Midlands. And then on the motorcycle point, something I'm actually really pleased about, we have secured the inward investment from Norton, a company that went bust, reinvigorated by Indian investors. And we did the deal for it to be located in Solihull, and it will make e-motorbikes right here in the West Midlands, part of a clean recovery.
Thanks very much, Andy. And on this one, finally, over to Tim.
I forgot to mention that pension funds should be investing with Triodos Bank, who look for companies that contribute to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Our partial, regional, fare-free public transport should be extended from old crocs like me to all the younger age groups. If they can do it for me, they can do it for you. It only needs extending. Instead of Metro bus on rails, tram can easily totally free in order to cut congestion, as a reward and incentive for doing the right and leaving the car at home. I cycle work, use my push bike for my social on very every life over the last 50 to 20 years. Only ice and snow me. By the end of my social work, I was able to gain 20 pence per mile on official council business. It should be given to motorcyclists too. I use the car only for cycle short journey, even to get my COVID vaccine. Fuel rationing with coupon cards as were issued during the 73-74 energy crisis last century. With careful driving below 70 miles per hour, I get over 70 miles per gallon with those longer journeys. Please attend the Climate Action Network West Midlands public Zoom meeting on fare-free public transport on Wednesday, 24th of March. And here's a suggestion to declare Ursnor in action, never fly, follow that heroine of our time, Saint Greta Thunberg, who used the very lowest climate worsening transport, even down to using a racing yacht.
Thanks very much, Tim. Okay, then. We've now got a question from Nina Patel, who is from Coventry. And she asks, with the government slashing £2 billion from the Green Homes grant, what are your plans to help fund the retrofitting of the poorest and the hardest to heat homes in our community. And first off here is Ashvir, please.
Well, I think this point about government slashing budgets in this area and in many others gets to the heart we see in local elections or mayoral elections. We can only get this one legacy if lots of money to us to get to work on it. And I think we have to remember that fundamentally the UK is run from London. They make the big decisions, they control the purse strings, and something has to be done, something different has to be done to shape London out of the way things have always been. I mean, everyone outside London, Chris, is effectively stood with a begging bowl in a sense, saying, please London, can we have some more? And that's no way to run a country. And it's not how other countries work. Other countries are much more balanced. Right around the world, lots of examples of that. And the mayor is a uniquely directly elected local leader with a unique democratic mandate and should essentially, in my view, operate a West Midlands cabinet. You know, Lord Heseltine once allegedly said that leaders in London don't trust local leaders to run a bath. And I don't know if that's true or not, if he really said it, but he did say it. You know, Labour on Birmingham City Council keeping a CEO in place for more than hours at a time, a few weeks at a time, is not going to. I think the greater show that the powerhouse shown, I think that is the way to go. And to use another example along the Hestline line, George Osborne, when he was chairman, is again to have said that the way metro mayors will work is if they scare people. So I do some confrontation, and I think some smart action, more power, and perhaps independent could be a great bridge to develop that unity across the West Midlands, to present a united front when getting London to hand over power and money that is sorely needed in our region.
Thanks very much, Ashvir. Over to Andy, please.
Yeah, so the question's about retrofitting and how we get momentum on it. And interesting, because it's the area I chose as a priority because it's the one that's actually proving probably the most challenging to get momentum on. For central government, that is the right thing to do. That's absolute, because I'm a huge, there is actually a strong economic case here in its own, it's also a social case. The question for me, well, how are you going to make momentum given we haven't got large amounts of money from central government? The way we haven't failed to, but we've yet secured that. So what we're going to do, what I think we should do is we should have a demonstrate area that we should pay for to demonstrate the economic case, the social case, one small area that they look, we're about it, done it. And that would make our case much, much more compelling, as well as beginning, of course, to make a small step forward. And I'm hoping that the City Board will agree that very shortly.
Thank you, Andy. Over to Jenny, please.
So, I mean, Green Grant has really been a bit of a fiasco from the outset, and it's originally set up. It was only sort of set up for an initial 6-month period. The number of homes they were wanting to insulate wasn't significant. Hasn't been done. There's a lack of skills and ability to actually do it. And although they sort of extended the period, now the funding hasn't been carried forward, and it's a bit of a mess, frankly. And it's frustrating because, as Andy says, it's really fundamental and important in terms of both cutting emissions, solving fuel poverty, and actually creating those green jobs as well. So there's so many advantages from going ahead with this scheme. It's incredibly frustrating that central government has approached it in this way and isn't really taking it seriously. So Liberal Democrats have been calling on government to spend 150 billion over the next 3 years on green economic recovery from the pandemic. And part of that will be a 10-year programme to upgrade our houses and our businesses by 2030, cutting bills, ending fuel poverty for everybody. We've got to get an emergency programme in place to reduce energy consumption and to address this issue. So retrofitting is fundamentally important, but the difficulty is, as we say, with the funding. We don't have access to the amounts of money that we need to actually roll out this programme across the West Midlands. So we do have to really push and press and continue to challenge central government to get us that money.
Thank you very much, Jenny. And over to Liam, please.
Thanks. So the key here is to get devolved control over the government budget for retrofitting. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So the first is that we can't go net zero carbon unless we begin retrofitting about 75,000 homes a year. That's the only way that we can bring the net zero carbon target into the mid 2030s. That's a pretty big number, but it's not impossible. But the second big reason that we need this quickly is because if you look at any Green New Deal measure for creating jobs, the measure that creates the most jobs fastest is retrofitting. So for every £1 million you spend on investment, you create more jobs by spending that money on retrofitting than absolutely anything else. So the Green New Deal, the Green Homes grant run from Westminster has been a catastrophe, but the government has got to put something in its place because its own 10-point plan has made pretty significant commitments about decarbonising buildings. And so what we've got to do is to get devolved control of that money so that we can actually begin running quite significant schemes, because rather than simply leaving it to the market, you've actually got to have a creative state regionally helping coordinate things. So if you think about the homes that you know in the West Midlands, whether it's blocks of flats, whether it's some of that old Victorian and Edwardian housing in some of our inner cities, even whether it's, you know, some of the kind of 1950s accommodation out on estates in the suburbs, a group coordinated approach to retrofitting will go much faster and it will be much cheaper. And crucially, it can help us lift 200,000 families out of fuel poverty. So, you know, the case has got to be made that you cannot run this kind of program from Westminster. Give us the tools and we will do the job.
Okay, thank you, Liam. And over to Steve, please.
Thanks, Chris. I'm a bit frustrated by this because I've been working on retrofit recently in Solihull Council, where my group came up with quite an innovative approach to funding this. So some of you'll know that several of the authorities recently have decided to extend a loan to Birmingham Airport. Solihull was one of those. So we said, well, if you must do that, and we didn't support it, by the way, the airport would be just fine without public monies. But if you must do that, ring fence the profits and use them to retrofit domestic and commercial properties here in the borough. Now, we presented that as a budget amendment and I authored and researched it myself, so I know it was financially sound and it would have worked. The Tory administration in Solihull voted it down on purely political grounds because there's an election coming. And then the next week, Rishi Sunak decides he's going to take £2 billion out of the Green Homes Grant Fund. So I just don't think either Team Red or Team Blue are up to this. We've just heard Andy say he wouldn't divest from fossil fuels. And a couple of weeks ago, he was on social media trumpeting a plan to lay more roads in Wolverhampton. You know, there's a climate crisis on. More roads means more traffic, and induced demand is a really well-known phenomenon, you know. But at the same time, we've got Labour-controlled Birmingham Council paying the airport to restore passenger numbers, and Labour-controlled Coventry Council just this week is publishing plans to widen roads in Earlsdon, and there isn't a cycle lane in sight. So it just says to me, you can't trust either of them on the climate crisis. They've got the wrong dates, they've got the wrong ideas, they just don't get it. So give the job to someone who does.
Thank you very much, Steve. Over to Tim now, who
the rich like me must tell the government that we must pay more in taxes and spend less in order to respond to the climate emergency, and at the same time build that much fairer, ecological and community-rich society of low greenhouse gas emissions. Pay freeze for the rich, certainly in the top 2 income tax bands. Hefty pay rise for the nurses and carers paying the basic rate of tax. I will even pay. Scrap the £15 billion to 2040 going into underground and overground bus on rail tram extensions, scrap Sprint that is also unnecessarily expensive, and use the money for fair, free public transport and for insulating every home in the land. The rest of us must pay through our taxes for low incomes to have their homes done for them. Scrap HS2 extensions for instead trains back on the tracks. 106 kilometres in our region alone, although 6 kilometres have just gone for trams. Insulate every building and put PV solar on every east, west and south facing roof, as I have done with my home. I've got 12 on each side. The economic principle is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Not economic growth, greed, but ecological harmony with nature and restraint to survive and to improve our prospects. And this is my Declare a Personal Climate Action 2020 vision. Live in the room no higher than 20 degrees Celsius. Try and get 10 units of electricity a day and no more. But if you drive, a minimum of 10 miles per litre for your car.
Thank you very much, Tim. And now it's over to Ashvir.
Well, we've already addressed that point, Chris. You're asking me the same question again?
You've already done it. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So we're all. My word, you're flying through it, aren't you?
One point I would add, Chris. Actually, you're giving me the opportunity. Is towards the very end of his answer, Andy said that it's not that we failed to ask London, and I think he's quite right. But I think my point is we failed to get. And I think that, and this is not specific to Andy as a Conservative mayor. It's a Labour-run Birmingham City Council has been let down by London for many, many decades. I think Andy has been let down by London in a number of respects. I think this is a broader issue of the balance between Westminster and West Midlands. And all I'm saying, doing the same thing over and over again, we have to do something different. We have to confront them in a different way.
Right.
To get a better result.
Okay, fine. Thanks very much, Ash. Do apologise for that, folks. We now have a question from Fiona Kells from Walsall, and this is more about governance and how the Combined Authority does its business. And Fiona asks, what will you do to open up the WMCA, West Midlands Combined Authority, to more public participation, including on climate and environmental issues? And the first one to have a go at that is going to be Tim.
Each of the 7 councils must have a full and fair discussion of the pros and cons, then debate and vote over whether it is wise, with scarce resources and looming climate catastrophe, to be spending £15 billion of gas and oil to escalate greenhouse gases, to be making all that worse on something so totally unnecessary, grossly extravagant and self-indulgent, when buses and regional trains must be free, and the commuter trains must be put back on existing, already built but wasted railway lines, not trams. If Edinburgh City Council has done it before going ahead with their grandiose tram and then tram extension 2 years ago, why can't the English? Officers and members of our councils must also make themselves much more available to meet members of the public via Zoom, Teams or phone. We have a closed and secretive decision-making by unknown people. Many elected councillors don't have a clue or any interest in transport and just leave it up to 16 Summer Lane to get on with it. This is just not good enough. Declare a personal climate action is this suggestion. Please have a new determination to phone or email officers and members of your council to try and persuade them to do the sensible, low carbon, low impact thing. Encourage them not to be hypocrites after declaring a climate emergency and then doing nothing, apart from carrying on regardless with business as usual. This is hopeless and tragic. And please lobby for the transformation of the 22-kilometre Black Country Cycle Walk mudway between Brierley Hill and northwest Wolverhampton, so we can actually use it. And don't forget, sign the commitment.
Thank you very much, Tim. And it's over to Steve now, please.
Thanks, Chris. One of the Green Party's key political pillars is localism. We believe in devolving decision-making to the lowest effective and practicable level. We actually don't think elected mayors are a particularly good thing. And if we were making the rules, this position wouldn't exist, but we're not yet making the rules. Scrutiny of the combined authority is appalling, and it has been since day one. Compare us to the London Assembly, who have 25 directly elected members holding Sadiq Khan to account. If I'm returned as mayor, I will call for a similarly elected body for the West Midlands. And if the Minister for Communities, Housing and Local Government doesn't support that, then I'll convene an unofficial body myself to do the job. We also need to recognise the fundamental principle of participation, or nothing about us without us. And I would convene citizens' assemblies to cover environment, transport, housing, public health, and with the cooperation of the PCC, crime and policing as well. And I would wrap a meaningful diversity assembly around all of these to ensure that every issue is approached with an intersectional lens. I think people have had enough of politicians only being accountable every 4 years, and I agree. So I think my watchwords as mayor will be transparency and empowerment.
Thanks very much, Steve. And now we're going over to Jenny, please.
I think people are pretty tired of politicians imposing decisions on them. And I think we can achieve a lot more if we actually listen to people's lived experiences and involve them in the decisions that affect their lives. So I want to see residents, community groups, businesses, public sector, and experts all working together to address the challenges that we're facing. So I'm with Steve on citizens' assemblies. I want to see local citizens' assemblies to ensure that the public are fully engaged in finding solutions to our greatest challenges around, tackling climate emergency and addressing systemic racism in our public institutions. It needs to be a two-way conversation. I want to involve experts to actually educate people. People need to understand the gravity of the situation that we're facing. So it's about bringing them on a journey. We've seen the impact of the Blue Planet programme on people stopping using single-use plastics and sort of public pressure that brought. So if we want to change behaviour from everyone, which is what we need to do to really address the climate emergency, it's no good just imposing solutions on people. We need to explain to them what's needed so they really understand it, and they are then involved and bought in to the decisions and finding the solutions that we make. We've got to make sure this includes the most vulnerable communities and people who are traditionally underrepresented, to make sure they have a real voice in decision making. So I want to see really meaningful consultations with people, not just the usual tick box exercises that so often happen at the moment across our local authorities.
Thanks very much, Jenny. Over to Liam.
Thanks, Chris. So I've been very influenced in answering this question by what I found working in East Birmingham over the last 16, 17 years. So I was elected with a majority of 450, and it's now the biggest Labour majority in the West Midlands. And the reason that we've been able to build that majority is because we do residents' meetings all the time. When I was first elected, we were doing them twice a week. And so, I came to believe early on in my political career that you cannot know what you're talking about. You cannot know what you're doing unless you are constantly listening. And that's why I've been experimenting with deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies over the last couple of years around this issue of climate change. So there's three things that we need to do, in my experience. One, Extinction Rebellion, principle number one, tell the truth. We need politicians at all levels spelling out both the risks and the nature of the challenge and the level of ambition that we need. Second, give people the data. So I was really surprised about a year and a half ago, I started carrying around an air quality monitor when I go out campaigning. The air in my constituency is toxic. If we actually made air quality monitors pervasive school playgrounds, for example, you would begin to see the behaviour change, because people, once they realised the extent to which they're poisoning their children in the playground, would actually begin changing their behaviour quite quickly. Third, we need to learn a lesson from a lot of European cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Zaragoza, and actually start using deliberative democracy techniques, both physical and online, in a much more pervasive way. So the way that the Spanish or the Germans or the Greeks use this kind of technology for deliberative planning or participatory budgeting is something we ought to be learning from. It's not difficult, but actually the UK is a long way behind. And I would like the West Midlands to be an absolute pioneer and a leader of this. But ultimately, that is going to take a mayor, who is down at street level and is pretty comfortable organising residents' meetings, making cups of tea with people, and just listening to what people have got to say. Ultimately, there's nothing we can't achieve in the West Midlands with our common sense and practical wisdom. We just need to bring it together behind some ambitious targets.
Thank you. Over to Ashvir, please.
Well, I think we need to understand, just from a public participation perspective, just how dire the picture is right now. In 2012, there was a referendum in Birmingham on having a city mayor, and people rejected it. Then a few years later, when the Metro Mayor position was introduced, of the 2 million people who could vote, only about 500,000 did. About 1.5 million didn't bother, about 75%. So something's going pretty wrong, because politics at its best is the way that we decide how our money is spent and how our lives are lived and how our society is organized. But it's so far removed from that for most people. Most people have just no longer make that connection, in my view. So I think a key part of that is empowering on the ground leaders in communities. And I think what that means is funding them. It means funding them. The money talks. I think it means funding people with a proven track record of delivery. And I also think we should make politics exciting. We should make this exciting and imaginative and set out some bold visions. And a great way to do this is to have a prize. So prizes can be these rallying moments. So the Earthshot Prize, which Prince William and the royal family have introduced, is a rallying point where you find the smartest ideas. Switch Delhi, the mayor of Delhi set up in India, which incentivizes switching to electric vehicles. There's a company in Birmingham called Acceleron, which is working on recyclable batteries. The Clean Kilo, the zero waste supermarket in Birmingham, like all of these great initiatives and many more I haven't mentioned. Let's put them forward and offer them a prize to compete for, where we back real winners. And finally, Chris, the mayoral election is on the 6th of May. From May to August, let's see a summer of change where we see some big change happen straight out of the gate, which encourages public participation, gets people excited. And one of the things I've suggested is that we sell the head office, which is, in my view, very poorly located, move the mayor's office to a landmark location that really excites.
Thank you, Ashvir. That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Ashvir. Thank you. Now it's over to Andy.
So the question is about, are we willing to take input, really? So let me explain what we've tried to do on this, because I absolutely get the sense of this, and I hope you'll feel that the evidence is that we have tried to step into this. So if we look at the approach to the climate challenge, first of all, when we moved to the climate emergency, it was me who said to the youth climate strike team, yes, come present. I tell you, some people said to me I was mad, but I was determined to do it because I wanted to hear the most legitimate voice. And actually, at that point, it was far from certain that every authority was declaring a climate emergency. We did that. Then, of course, we set up the Young Combined Authority, and every board meeting now, this issue is right there through the voices of the Young Combined Authority in the decision making. What we then did, when we set our first proposals for 2041, was we opened it to public consultation. That ran for about 3 months. We had an avalanche of views on this subject, given the importance, and there's a structure through which that is done. Citizens Assembly last summer, when we were beginning to think about our recovery from COVID, perhaps looking back on it, it was a bit premature given how events have moved out. We did do a Citizens Assembly run by Britain Thinks in a very structured way, representative of the region. And then lastly, we have got a firm commitment to a net zero citizens panel to input permanently to our developing thinking. So those 5 clear actions for all evidence that we did set our minds open to input from people who had expert opinion on this subject. And that would be the spirit with which we go forward.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's great. Now then, I'm probably going to take a chair's prerogative here. We've got one more question. And I'm going to say that we do the next question because this is the one on sprawl and the green belt and nature. We won't do, though, the summing up at the end unless people have got extra time to stay over. So unless anybody sort of like bashes me over the head with a virtual mallet, that's what we're going to try and do over the next 10 minutes. I'm going to also reopen the polling, so we'll be able to see whether there's been any change during the evening to see how your views have changed, and we'll come to that at the end. So very, very quickly then, the final question has come in from Sheila Cooper, Sarah Maycock and Belle Woodward, and they are asking us, how can West Midlands local authorities and the mayoral candidates justify the huge loss of green belt land, green space and its ecology and biodiversity to inappropriate development while debating concerns over the climate change emergency? And on that one, the first person I'm going to go to is Jenny.
I think clearly it can't be justified. I think there's possibly less wide public awareness of the ecological emergency than the climate emergency, but there certainly is also an ecological emergency. There's about a 41% decrease of species in the UK since 1970. 13% of all wildlife species in England are currently threatened with extinction, and there's 133 species already extinct. So it's an emergency. We do need, as we've talked about, a significant house building programme because we have a desperate shortage of affordable housing, but that focus needs to be on brownfield development. So housing prioritised on brownfield sites, reduce urban sprawl, reduce car dependency, and that needs to be our focus on our urban regeneration. I'm keen that we really focus on, those brownfield sites. I think occasionally there will be justification for greenbelt development, but we've got to really understand what we're doing. We need to do proper assessments to understand the impact, to understand the ecological value of the land that we're looking at. And if such developments deemed necessary, then I'd also want to see, in parallel to that, investment into other green spaces to improve biodiversity in other areas. We also need to look at including space for nature and including tree cover in all new developments, so that when we're doing builds and developments, we're actually building nature into those developments and giving, homes for people and also homes for wildlife.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Over to Ash, please.
Well, I think whether it's loss of greenbelt or any other issue, it stems from a lack of power and funding. So we talk about consultation, we can talk about input, but it really can't emphasize enough that it comes down to where the power and money sits, and we need to change those flows. Specifically on the point about green space, I don't think any candidate is trying to justify losses in greenbelt land and green space. I think we all appreciate that we're blessed with great green space in Birmingham and the West Midlands that we need to preserve. I think we can do more to green the city and green the region, including through a mass tree planting program. And I think also, to that point about changing the flows of power and money, more community owned and operated green spaces is also something we should look at. There's examples already like Wally Woods, but we should involve some of the local wildlife trusts and others to do more work on community owned and run green spaces. And absolutely we should focus on brownfield urban regeneration and not just rather than building on the green belt. And actually, to be fair to the current administration and Andy, that has been something they've been trying to do. We should see more of it, and not just intention, but also delivered.
Okay, thank you very much, Ash. And now we're going to move on to Steve, please.
Thanks, Chris. I suspect Andy's going to talk about his brownfield first strategy. Problem is the reality doesn't match the rhetoric. In my own borough of Solihull, 16 of 18 sites brought forward in the latest housing plan are in the Greenbelt. So I'm not really sure which brownfield has been put first there. The problem is there is a housing crisis and we urgently need to fix it, but it's being left to the private development sector to fix. And the fact is that the profit motive is always going to override other considerations. Greenbelt is just easier to develop than brownfield. It's as simple as that. We have to provide housing, and that is inescapable. Hundreds of thousands of people are living in poverty across the 7 authorities today, and housing costs play a huge part in that. But it's how we do it that is the urgent question. We talked about this earlier. Retrofitting and reconditioning has to be the priority. And where new build is unavoidable, appropriate land usage and the very highest standards of energy efficiency, both in operation and in construction, have got to take priority over developer profits. For me, that means local authorities have to start stepping in and taking an active role, whether that's becoming major house builders again, or by supporting cooperative land trusts and development projects to provide an alternative to the Bovis box approach. Appropriate development is the key. And as mayor, I would be very clear about my support for local authorities that buy into my vision for the housing crisis and the poverty scandal that it helps to drive.
Thank you very much, Steve. And after Stephen, we have Tim, please.
I never wanted grandchildren because I'm so concerned about the future and the housing crisis. But 2 little girls came last November anyway. Please live in small homes like mine, mid-terrace, 3-story, 3-bedroom townhouse with tiny garden and a compost bin. I'm an enthusiastic, organic guerrilla gardener and footpath activist in our 32 square kilometre Golden Green Triangle. I'm fully supporting Andy and Professor Catherine Moore for it to become officially the first part of the West Midlands National Park. My name for it is the Clent Hills Regional Park in the triangle of major roads on the western side of the M5 between junctions 3 and 4. Don't, you mayors, do open cast mining of our countryside. No more concrete, brick and tarmac. It is needed for growing our food as locally as possible. Encourage allotments and vegetable gardens. Open spaces are only for farming and recreation, and no more buildings, please. And here's a declare a personal climate action for you. Use public transport or cycle in order to walk my 4 reopened public footpaths in our 32 square kilometre Clent Hills Regional Park.
Thank you very much, Tim. Now it's over to Liam.
Thanks, Chris. So, look, I think this has been a really good discussion tonight, and people have got to come away with it reflecting on what is a big choice that they've got to make in May. Who do they think is going to be a mayor that is actually going to reset the net zero carbon targets for our region? Who's going to bring the ambition for us to become the first net zero carbon region in the country? And who is going to rally the region to actually deliver that plan? I believe that I can do that. Over the last couple of years, I have fought to put the principles that Labour for a Green New Deal has pioneered in our party at the centre stage of what will be the greenest Labour manifesto that any candidate in my party has ever run on. That does mean rebuilding affordable homes because, you know, Tim, many of my constituents would love a garden, but in the inner cities, 1 in 5 of our homes are overcrowded. That's why we need a mayor who's actually going to start building affordable homes and homes for social rent. Second, we need to protect our green spaces with a charter for nature and be radical about seeking 25% tree canopy cover. That means 1 to 2 trees extra per person by 2035 in a new Commonwealth Jubilee forest that we start planting after May. But finally, we've got to do this in a way that creates jobs. The government has said that it wants to create 2 million green collar jobs by 2030. We will only get our share of those jobs if we are ambitious. 200,000 green collar jobs could come to our region, but not if we lack ambition, not if we're prisoners of our modesty. We will win those jobs and recreate those jobs, recreate the future of our industry for our children and grandchildren if we're determined to be a leader. The green industrial revolution should happen here. We were the region that led the carbon revolution 309 years ago when Thomas Newcomen demonstrated the steam engine. We now need to lead in this century the zero carbon revolution. We should do that in a way that restores the beauty and the clean air of our green and pleasant land, but let's do it in a way that creates prosperity for the people here too.
Thank you very much, Liam. And finally, over to Andy.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Steve said I would talk about brownfield first, and he's right. Yeah, because when we had these debates 4 years ago, there wasn't the degree of agreement on this that there is now. And actually, I do think that under my leadership, the combined authority has shown real determination over this. Critically, we've doubled the number of homes being built in the region over the last 5 years. And it looks as though this year, again, despite all the challenges, will be a good outcome on that. So we're building the homes, but they are on brownfield location. And the way in which we've been able to do that, coming back to a previous debate, is we have won funding from government to subsidise those schemes for brownfield regeneration. And frankly, that has been necessary because a developer will always choose the rich pickings of Greenbelt rather than brownfield if you let them. We've done that. I would say, though, that we have not had unanimity. And I would just ask the Labour Party to consider its position in Coventry on that as we're having this discussion tonight. Coventry City Council's proposal on the local plan is seeing Greenbelt destroyed in Kersley, in Easton Green, in Pickford Green, and currently I have asked the Secretary of State to call in those planning applications. That's Labour running one of our biggest city, failing to deliver a brownfield policy. And for example, they've currently turned down the Abbots Lane brownfield regeneration right in the city centre, a scheme that the WMCA was ready to fund. So we are committed utterly to that policy, and one of our biggest Labour councils is not fulfilling it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Andy. I think that, oh, where am I gone? I've lost myself. Right, okay. I think that brings us to a useful conclusion. We've overrun by about 15 minutes. So in closing, I'm going to just touch on a couple of things really. One is that there is another Green Hustings taking place on the 30th of March, and we'll be finding out more about that in the near future. The second thing is, don't forget that you can vote on May the 6th. And there will also be everywhere but Birmingham, there will be local elections. So it is an important time in the West Midlands to invoke your political franchise and get out there and vote. And also in terms of the Metro Mayor election, do please go and find out more about the voting system, because it's a supplementary voting system. So I think before you vote, whether you're going to vote by post, and I'm sure many, many people this year will vote by post, but if you're going to vote physically, do make sure you understand how the voting system works before you vote. And also, and I think that one of the things that hasn't really come out tonight, but on the same day, we will also be voting for the Police and Crime Commissioner. And I think it will be interesting to see how the Mayor and the Police and Crime Commissioner are able to work together over the next 4 years, especially with things such as road danger and speeding and the sort of things that are affecting why people don't walk and cycle and feel fearful of going out in their local areas. So with that, I think we're going to draw it to a close. I don't know how we do this, but if you could all do in your houses, if you've been sitting down for the last hour and a half, stand up, do a few exercises, maybe clap your hands, go whoop, 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 or whatever you might well do. But I think do from ourselves, the organisers, Coventry Green New Deal here tonight, myself as the chair, thank the candidates for turning up and for answering their questions in great detail and quite honestly. And I also think that we covered a huge amount of topics and issues this evening. So hopefully you will all go away more informed about how all of our candidates are going to deal with the climate and nature emergencies that affect us all. So thanks a lot for coming along, and enjoy the rest of your evening, and we'll see you soon. Thanks a lot. Good night.